Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So today's episode comes to you courtesy of John, who's been supporting this channel as a Golden Pig tier patron. And actually, for this episode, John wanted to dedicate it to their friend Alex, so happy birthday, Alex. And for their birthday pick, Alex chose Yennett Cryptic Sovereign with a creature focus. Yennett is a 3/5 Sphinx with Flying Vigilance and Menace that costs 2 white, blue, black. Whenever Yennett Cryptic Sovereign attacks with the top card of your library, if that card's converted mana cost is odd, you may cast without paying its mana cost, otherwise draw a card. So, Yennett is pretty hard to block, having both Flying and Menace, both great forms of evasion, so generally she can get through. And being able to safely attack during combat is obviously a very important thing for this commander because we are getting a ton of value off of an attack. Or again, I should say that we are getting some sort of value off of every attack. At the very least, we get to draw a card. But if we hit an odd card, whether that card costs 1 or if that card costs 9, we are casting it for free. So because of that, I threw another challenge into this deck for myself, and every single card in this deck is odd. Except for the lands. The lands don't count. Regardless, as long as we hit a non-land card off the top of our library, we are casting that for free thanks to this commander. And yeah, there are some really powerful things that we can hit off the top, especially some really powerful creatures, and yeah, once we get things rolling, it can be really hard to stop us. And of course, this is a very budget-friendly deck with every single card outside of the commander, which just missed the cutoff, is less than $1. So with all that said, let's jump into it. First up, setting the top of our library can be a very important thing and can have a huge impact on how our turn plays out. So we can utilize cards like Otherworldly Gaze, Portent, and Preordain to do so. Otherworldly Gaze is an instant for a blue that says look at the top 3 cards of your library, put any number of them into your graveyard, and the rest back on top of your library in any order, and we can flash it back for 1 in a blue. So being able to rearrange or ditch cards that are on top of our library can be huge. Before we attack, if one of our top 3 things is something massive, well, we just put that on top and we swing away. Speaking of which, we've got Portent, which says, look at the top 3 cards of target player's library, then put them back in any order. You may have the player shuffle their library, draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. So that delayed draw in this case can really help us out, again, basically rearranging the top of our library to ensure that we hit something big. And even Preordain can help us out as well. It says scry to, then draw a card. So again, when we scry, we can choose to put the cards on the bottom of our library if we want, or rearrange them on the top. And speaking of scrying, we've also got Aqueous Form, Crystal Ball, and Prognostic Sphinx. Aqueous Form says enchanted creature can't be blocked. Whenever enchanted creature attacks, scry 1. So this aura can help get our commander through, and again on top of that, whenever our commander attacks, we scry 1 first to see what the top card of the library is before we decide if we actually want that to be the card that we're actually going to cast for free, since we can actually stack those triggers. Regardless, next up we've got a fantastic artifact for this deck with Crystal Ball. It has pay 1, tap, scry 2. So for just 1 mana, we can continue to know what's on top of our library and to set the top of our library in the order that we want to, or to ditch things that we don't want. Moving on, we've got Prognostic Sphinx, a 3/5 flyer that has discard a card. Prognostic Sphinx gains hexproof until end of turn, tap it. Whenever Prognostic Sphinx attacks, scry 3. So this has some built-in protection that allows us to discard a card to save it from target removal, but more importantly, when it attacks, we scry 3. And again, since we can stack the triggers between this and our commander, well, we're going to have this one go first. So that if we have something massive off the top 3, we're just going to put that on top for our commander's trigger. But of course, we can also scry with an enchantment like Retreat to Coralhelm. It has landfall. Whenever land enters battlefield under control, you choose 1. You may tap or untap target creature or scry 1. Obviously, the vast majority of the time, we're going to pick that second option, but there are definitely going to be circumstances where being able to tap down a creature or untap a creature can help us out too. And speaking of enchantments, we've also got Future Sight, which says, put the top card of your library revealed, you may play the top card of your library. So this allows us to know exactly what is on top of our library before we even choose to do any of our scry effects or anything like that. And on top of that, again, since we can play the top card of our library, if we don't want to hit that with our commander, we can get rid of it. Well, okay, I should say we can get rid of it by either casting it, in the normal way off the top of our library, or if it's a land, we can actually play that land from the top of our library as well as our land drop for the turn. Now, as good as these cards are in this deck, there is one, in my opinion, that stands above the rest, and that is the Golden Pig of this deck, which is the number 1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Penance. Penance is an enchantment that costs 2 and a white, and it's a pretty old card, so I'm going to read its Oracle text. It says, put a card from your hand on top of your library. The next time a black or red source of your choice would deal damage this turn, prevent that damage. Now, preventing damage isn't really what we really care about with this card. I mean, if worse comes to worse, we can actually target our commander with this. We don't really care about it dealing damage really all that much, but if an opponent has a black or red source, sure, we can choose that. Regardless, the important thing is that we need a target with this, and yes, the actual cost of this by having to put a card from our hand on top of our library is actually a very good thing for this deck. We might have a massive card that we would rather cheat out with our commander than actually pay for, so instead of actually paying for it, we just put that card from our hand on top of our library, prevent damage from a black or red source, and then we know we're going to hit that with our commander's trigger. So instead of that card being a potentially dead card in our hand that we can't cast, well, now it is something that we can cast for free with our commander by cheating on its cost. This is a great card that can lead to some fantastic plays, and that's what makes it the Golden Pig. But we also have some one-off effects that can help us get cards from our hand on top of our library with cards like Brainstorm, Brainstone, and Dream Cache. Brainstorm says draw 3 cards and put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. And then Brainstone does the exact same thing, but it's the artifact version of this. We have to pay 2 and tap and sacrifice it to do so. And finally, Dream Cache says draw 3 cards and put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library, or both on the bottom of your library. But now that we've talked about setting the top of our library, what kinds of things do we want to hit? So now let's talk about those massive creatures, and keep in mind, again, everything in this deck has an odd converted mana cost, so let's start off with some 7 mana creatures with Teysa, Angelic Arbiter, and Luminant Primordial. Teysa, Envoy of Ghosts, is a 4/4 that has vigilance and protection from creatures, and whenever a creature deals combat damage to you, destroy that creature, create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. So obviously Teysa is a fantastic attacker and a fantastic blocker, having protection from creatures and vigilance, but more importantly, if opponents choose to actually attack us, their creatures are going to get destroyed and replaced with tiny spirits. And speaking of choices, Angelic Arbiter says, each opponent who casts a spell this turn can attack with creatures, each opponent who attacks with a creature this turn can't cast spells. So this can definitely slow our opponents down and make really tough decisions for them. And then Luminant Primordial says when it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, exile up to 1 target creature that player controls, and that player gains life equal to its power. Basically, triple Swords to Plowshares on ETB, so yeah, some great removal. And speaking of removal, let's talk about Overseer of the Damned. When it enters the battlefield, we can destroy target creature. Whenever a non-token creature an opponent controls dies, we create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token. So not only can this get rid of a pesky creature when it comes into play, but of course on top of that, we benefit whenever our opponent's creatures die. Speaking of which, there's Lorcan, which has, whenever a creature card is put in an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you may pay life equal to its mana value. If you do, put it on the battlefield under your control. It's a Warlock addition with other types. If a Warlock you control would die, exile it instead. So if an opponent has a particularly spicy creature in play, well, we can steal that creature when it dies. And speaking of stealing creatures, we've got the Ape Snake Thieving Amalgam, which says at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, you manifest the top card of that player's library. Which again means that we put on the battlefield face down as a 2/2 that we can turn it face up for its mana cost if it's a creature card. On top of that, it says whenever a creature we control but don't own dies, its owner loses 2 life and we gain 2 life. So not only can we get things off the top of our opponent's libraries now, but we also can drain them when those things die. Next up though, we've got Angel of Serenity, which says when it enters the battlefield, you may exile up to 3 other target creatures from the battlefield and or creature cards from graveyards. And when Angel of Serenity leaves the battlefield, return the exiled cards to the owner's hands. So this is actually a very flexible card that can help us out either getting rid of creatures in play or helping even get us some of our things back from our graveyard. But one particularly brutal card for this deck is Butcher Malkir, which has, whenever it or other creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. This can be a very painful card for opponents to play against because, again, if they take out any of our creatures, well, their creatures are going to suffer as well. And actually, one creature that we might not care about dying all that much is Enigma Sphinx. It has, when it's put into your graveyard from the battlefield, put it into your library third from the top, and Cascade. Cascade means that when you cast this spell, you exile cards to the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less. You can cast without paying its mana cost, but the exile cards to the bottom of your library in a random order. So basically, when we cast this, we can get something of lesser mana value for free off the top of our library. And again, when this dies, it goes back into our library third from the top, so we know exactly where it's at, and we can get it back again with our commander for free. And as you might have noticed, like our commander, we've got a good amount of flyers in this deck. So yeah, Wind Raider Sphinx can help us out a ton. It says whenever a creature with flying attacks, you may draw a card. And again, keep in mind with that, our opponent's creatures are counted with this as well. Next up though, yet another flyer Diluvian Primordial has when it enters the battlefield for each opponent, you may cast up to one target instant sorcery card from that player's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If a spell casts its way, we put in a graveyard this turn, exile it instead. Essentially, cast up to 3 things for free from our opponent's graveyards, and yeah, depending on what's in there, we can get a ton of value out of this. A somewhat similar card is Scholar of the Lost Trove, which has, when it enters the battlefield, you may cast target instant sorcery or artifact card from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. If an instant sorcery spell casts this way before your graveyard this turn, exile it instead. So, unlike Diluvian Primordial, this counts things from our graveyard and lets us cast 1 for free. Next up though, let's talk about some really heavy hitters like Serra Avatar. Its power and toughness are each going to be equal to our life total, and when it's put into a graveyard from anywhere, we shuffle into its owner's library. So even if our opponents can get rid of it, we can get it back, and again, this thing can be absolutely massive, and in many circumstances, it can be a one-shot KO. Speaking of which, there's Soul of Eternity, which its power and toughness are each equal to our life total as well, and on top of that, it's got Encore for 7 white. So essentially with Encore, we pay that cost and exile from our graveyard, and for each opponent, we create a token copy that attacks that opponent this turn if able. They gain haste, sacrifice to begin next end step, activate only as a sorcery. Basically, if we can get these through 100 opponents, they're going to be in big trouble. And then Goring Ceratops might only be a 3/3, but it does have double strike, and on top of that, when it attacks, other creatures we control gain double strike until end of turn. So this helps all of our heavy hitters hit twice as hard. Finally, we've got some 9 mana creatures as well with Artisan of Kozilek and Triplicate Titan. The Eldrazi is a particularly spicy card for this deck, a 10/9 with Annihilator 2, so when it attacks, the defending player sacrifices 2 permanents, and on top of that, when we cast this spell, we can return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. Again, Yennett is allowing us to cheat on this card's cost for free when we hit off the top, and then it lets us cheat something into play. And then Triplicate Titan is a 9/9 with Flying Vigilance and Trample that has, when it dies, we get a 3/3 golem with one of each of those. So this is a heavy hitter, and when it dies, we get some extra value out of it as well. And speaking of value, now let's talk about some cards that can provide us some value through card advantage with cards like Sphinx of Athun, Sandstone Oracle, and Vega the Watcher. Sphinx of Athun has, when it enters the battlefield, reveal the top 5 cards of your library, and upon separates those cards into 2 piles, put one pile into your hand, the other into your graveyard. Essentially, ETB Fact or Fiction. And then yet another Sphinx can help us out with Sandstone Oracle. It has, when it enters the battlefield, choose an opponent. If that player has more cards in hand than you, draw cards equal to the difference. But a card that can really provide us a ton of card advantage throughout the game is Vega the Watcher. It says, whenever you cast a spell from anywhere other than your hand, draw a card. So whether we're casting something with Yennett or with something like Future Sight off the top of our library, we can get a ton of value out of this. But moving on, we've also got some draw spells with cards like Winged Words, Rush of Knowledge, and Ugin's Insight. Winged Words is going to cost 1 less to cast if we control a creature with flying, and it says draw 2 cards. Rush of Knowledge says draw cards equal to the highest converted mana cost among permanents you control. And again, I mean, even just our commander is a 5 mana commander, so we can at least draw 5 with this if our commander's in play. But yeah, if we've got, say Artisan of Kozilek in play, we're going to be drawing 9 cards off of this. And then Ugin's Insight is somewhat similar. It says scry X, where X is the highest converted mana cost among permanents you control, then draw 3 cards. So again, scrying X can be massive for this deck, helping us set up the top of our library and drawing us 3 cards in the process. But then we just have some straight up big draw spells with Promise of Power and Overflowing Insight. Promise of Power is going to have us draw 5 cards and lose 5 life, and Overflowing Insight is just going to have us draw 7 cards. But now that we've talked about our plans, what are some ways that we can throw a wrench into our opponent's plans? Well, we can do so with the very flexible Esper Charm, which says choose 1 destroy target enchantment, draw 2 cards, or target player discards 2 cards. So obviously, depending on the situation that we're in, any of these modes can really help us out. And another flexible removal spell is Forsake the Worldly, which is going to exile target artifact or enchantment, or we can cycle it for 2. Next up, we've got some more 3-mana removal spells with Oblation, Generous Gift, and Vindicate. Oblation says the owner of target non-land permanent shovels into their library, then draws 2 cards, and keep in mind, we can actually target one of our things as well if we want to draw those cards. Next up, there's Generous Gift, which says destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. And giving someone a 3/3 is well worth the cost of destroying a permanent. Next up though, there's Vindicate, which is just going to straight up destroy target permanent. Moving on, let's talk about some board wipes with Cleansing Nova, Tragic Arrogance, and Time Wipe. Cleansing Nova is a flexible board wipe that says choose one, destroy all creatures, or destroy all artifacts and enchantments. And then Tragic Arrogance says for each player you may choose from among the permanents that player controls an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a planeswalker, then each player sacrifices all of the non-mana permanents they control. So this one gives us all the power in selecting exactly what we want to stay around. Speaking of selecting, there's Time Wipe, which says return a creature you control to its owner's hand and destroy all creatures. So we bounce one thing back to our hand, most likely our commander to save her, and then we say goodbye to everything else. Speaking of saying goodbye to everything else though, there's Necromantic Selection and In Garruk's Wake. Necromantic Selection says destroy all creatures, then return a creature card put in your graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. It's a black zombie to its other colors and types, exile Necromantic Selection. So essentially with this we can wipe the board and keep whatever we want on the board under our control. So that can be an opponent's creature, or if we just want to keep our commander around, Yennett. But an even more one-sided board wipe is In Garruk's Wake, which says destroy all creatures you don't control and all planeswalkers you don't control. Yeah, hitting this off the top of our library with Yennett can lead to a massive play, wiping our opponent's boards and letting us swing through. And we can also protect our massive spells with Thrix the Sudden Storm. It's a 4/5 with Flash and Flying that says spells you cast with converted mana cost 5 or greater cost 1 less to cast and can't be countered. That cost reduction is nice, but the more important part is that our opponents can't counter our massive spells when this is in play. And speaking of counters, we're also going to be running Salt Coming, Neutralize, and You Find the Villain's Lair. Each of them are going to counter target spell, and Salt Coming has Foretell for 1 in the blue, Neutralize can be cycled, and You Find the Villain's Lair could also instead just be draw 2, discard 2. So yeah, depending on the situation that we're in, that could be very useful. But now let's move on to our ramp in this deck, and first up, I definitely want to highlight Explorer's Scope, which says, whenever equipped creature attacks, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put on the battlefield tapped. This is huge with Yennett. Again, if we attack with Yennett with this equipped to her, well, we can look at the top card of our library. If it's a land, instead of, just whiffing essentially with Yennett for that, we put that into play, and then we've got a chance to actually hit something big with Yennett. Speaking of which, there's Mana Geode, which has, when it enters the battlefield, scry 1, and it can also tap to add 1 mana of any color. And then Midnight Clock can tap for a blue, where we can pay 2 and a blue to put an hour counter on Midnight Clock. And at the beginning of each upkeep, we get an hour counter on it. And keep in mind that is each upkeep counting our opponents as well. So when that 12th hour counter is put on Midnight Clock, we shuffle our hand and graveyard into our library, then draw 7 cards, exile Midnight Clock. This can be a great way to refill our hand off of a Mana Rock. And speaking of Mana Rocks, let's quickly go through the other ones with Commander Sphere, Darksteel Ingot, Dimir Locket, Azorius Locket, Orzhov Locket, Vessel Under Stress, Letter of Acceptance, and Honored Heirloom. And now I'm out of breath. But now that we have gone through every single non-land card in this deck, let's talk about the price. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, every single card in this deck outside of the commander, which again I believe the commander is $1.24, so just barely outside of that, is less than $1. So the estimated cost for this deck is just $30.62. And actually keep in mind that that estimated cost does include basic lands at 10 cents a piece, so you can save even more if you've already got those. And speaking of potential savings, you might be able to save even more by buying this deck on TCG Player and utilizing heavily played and damaged cards, which of course need a home too. Though do keep in mind that this estimated cost does not include the cost of shipping, which might vary depending upon where you live. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.